Lead story on CVM TV today looks at the heavy matter of constitutional reform. Now, I know it isn't sexy, but I know that it has been in the news over the past several days, perhaps few weeks, to be fair. And what we have now in front of us is the report from the Constitutional Reform Committee setting out just what they intend to amend the Jamaican Constitution to reflect. It is even more than an amendment. It's a new constitution that we're working towards, and it's the continuation of a process that began in 1991. So, what are the changes being proposed by by the Constitutional Reform Committee? What are the changes that our legislators are going to be asked to endorse? What are the changes to the Constitution that we, the people, are going to be asked to vote on in a referendum? We're going to do two shows on this issue. In the first one, I'm going to go through what it is that the Reform Committee has proposed, and in the second show, I'll hear from two members of the Constitutional Reform Committee who sat and made these recommendations, the reasoning behind the recommendations that they have made. So it's about educating you about what the reform process holds and then hearing from the stakeholders about why they made the decisions they ultimately made. It's why you love Lead Story, because you get information and understanding right here. Let's start the show. Welcome to Lead Story here on CVM TV. Now, as I told you, today's show is going to take a different form. I'm going to be going through the report of the Constitutional Reform Committee. 15 members sat and they came up with some recommendations. Those recommendations were put into a report. That report was sent to Cabinet. Cabinet approved that report. That report was then tabled as a ministry paper in the House of Representatives. A ministry paper is simply a document that outlines government policy. Now, that ministry paper is then going to form the basis of a decision by the House of Representatives, and it sets out, the ministry paper does, just what the changes to the Constitution as proposed or as recommended are. Now, let's walk slowly, because this process of constitutional reform did not begin in 2023 with the formation of this 15-member Constitutional Reform Committee. It's a process that can be traced all the way back to 1991, when the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional and Electoral Reform, JSCCER, was formed to do two things. Well, to do a few things. One was to review the existing constitution as it was and make recommendations for its reform. Now, that JSCCER, Joint Select Committee on Constitutional and Electoral Reform, began its work in 1992. It submitted a draft report in 1993. Then that draft report became a final report in 1994. That final report moved from 1994 to the Parliament in 1995, where the Parliament accepted the recommendations made. Very important, because some people would have you believe that this constitutional reform process only began last year with the Malahoo Fort Rocky Mead chaired group of people who sat to work. No, it began before that, all the way back in 1991. So what's the significance of giving you the history? It's because this Constitutional Reform Committee, which began its work in 2023, their task was clear, yeah? Their task was, and I'll read it here, it was established to provide expert guidance to the government and the people of Jamaica during a phased constitutional reform process, and the primary focus of this Constitutional Reform Committee is to consider and make recommendations for the implementation of the recommendations of the JCSSER from 1995. So you see, it is a continuum. So the work began, which began in 1991, which crystallized into a report in 1995, which the Parliament accepted those recommendations. This Reform Committee is tasked with saying, okay, given the passage of time, given changes nationally and internationally in the environment, what are the recommendations from 1995 that we are going to go forward with? What new things should we consider? So they're not starting from scratch, they're starting from where the work where the work was at in 1995. I was about to say where the work stalled, but the work didn't really stall. But it did stall for several years. But nevertheless, you get the drift. 1995 is the base year. 2023 is when the new committee was tasked with refreshing, looking back at what was agreed in 1995 and moving forward with those fresh recommendations. Also, this Constitutional Reform Committee is tasked with advancing those matters on which consensus remains. So there are a few points from 1995 on which both sides of the House had consensus. So this new committee has been told to, okay, go back to those things on which consensus was had between government and opposition and see if they are implementable now. Also, where consensus has eroded on certain points from 1995, let us see how we can rebuild that consensus on those significant matters. So again, 2023's Constitutional Reform Committee, all 15 of them, did not start their work from scratch. They started the work based on what was already done in 1995, and all they're looking at is to move ahead with the things that were agreed on from then and to look at where there was some haggling, some disagreement, and see if they could find a way forward. Now that you have accepted that, let's look at some critical issues here, because the new committee has been tasked with tackling some deeply entrenched provisions in the Constitution. These deeply entrenched positions require a referendum, and based on the report of this Constitutional Reform Committee, it appears as if a referendum is inevitable to solve some of the, to resolve some of the issues that are raised in the Constitutional Reform process. And I'll read for you what they say about amendment procedure. Because in this latest report that Cabinet approved and that has been tabled in Parliament as a ministry paper, it says, members are advised that the recommendations for implementation in this first phase of the constitutional reform process. Remember, this committee is looking to reform the Constitution over 3 phases. We are now in phase 1. So the recommendations for implementation in phase 1 involve the alteration process for the deeply entrenched provisions in the Constitution as set out at section 49.3 of this Constitution Reform Committee report. The process, this is the key part now, the process to amend these provisions require the holding of a referendum. Again, the process to amend these provisions require the holding of a referendum. So based on my reading of this, a referendum is inevitable. Before we go to our first break, I'm going to tell you what the issues are on which we will be asked to decide at a referendum. My producer says I have to give him the break now, so I'll tell you those when I return from the break. This is Lead Story. This is the education edition, trying to bring you up to speed with where the constitutional reform process is, what they are tasked with, and what they have come up with in the report that they submitted to Cabinet and which is now in the Parliament as a public document. More after this.